The first thing we want to be aware of is that all animals are communicating with each other, or you can think about it like leaving traces of their presence in land or water all the time, constantly. And that's just what biological organisms do. It's a function of their behavior and as well as their metabolism. And we want to think of it in terms of that this communication is both intentional and also unintentional, or you can think of it as unintended, and in some cases, even undesired. And so, for example, a coyote that's howling to its other pack members, that would be considered intentional communication, or perhaps a quail that's making a call to round up the other members in its flock. Whereas something like an animal leaving tracks on a landscape, or if it has a scent that it's leaving through the air when it's walking, oftentimes, obviously, that's unintentional because they have no control over that. And sometimes they don't even want that information being dispersed on the landscape. The other thing to keep in mind is that all animals across the spectrum listen in. We're not just talking about within a given species. So, for example, when the coyote makes the howl, not only do the other coyotes hear it, obviously all the other mammals, birds, and even insects are able to tune into that and hear that. And so when this information is broadcasted, everybody is listening in and getting information, gleaning information from that. Now, why is animal language important? Well, first of all, we have to think of it in terms of survival. It's absolutely essential for many reasons. And first and foremost is to avoid danger. So, animals oftentimes will send out warning signals to other members of their species. And again, other species pick up on this to warn of a potential threat in the area. They also do it to announce their presence. So again, most animals, particularly larger animals, don't want to bump into another animal or surprise it, particularly another animal that might be a threat. And so oftentimes they want to warn others that they are in the area. They also do it obviously to communicate with their offspring, and that can be for a variety of reasons, again, to let them know that they're coming, or to tell them some other important information, or advise them on their behavior. They do it as well to define their territories. So many species, whether it be birds up to large mammals, will do it to inform others that, hey, I've staked this area out, this is mine, I don't want any intruders, and for other similar reasons. They do it also to broadcast health. So many animals advise other animals of their state, and again, that can be to warn off potential threats or predators, or as well as look for others, including for reproductive reasons, right? So many animals will use animal language to communicate to others that, hey, I'm looking for a mate, and try to attract them. Of course, they do it also to find food, locate resources, and then relay that information back to others. Obviously, that's very key for members of their family or in their pack. And there are many other reasons as well why animals do this, which you could have an entire set of courses just on this subject alone. So let's look now at some animal language examples. Let's look at some actual examples of animal communications. And the first thing to realize is that there are many methods that they can utilize to communicate. And we're going to look at a few of those, the ones that are the most obvious to us and the most important. And the first method is via audible, or what we would think of as our normal hearing range. And that's something that all animals, almost all of them in the animal kingdom, the higher order organisms, have some form of hearing. And the great thing about hearing is that it's 360 degrees typically, as well as above and below. So it's something that's very easy to send signals and to listen into. And there's a number of examples of this. Some of the more obvious ones that we're familiar with are vocalizations or calls. So we can think about that obviously like bird songs, as well as perhaps a lion roaring. And again, these would typically be intentional signals that are sent across the landscape. Another form of communication that is sent through audible means are just movements over the land or water. And again, some of these could be intentional, but oftentimes they're unintentional. It could be like an armadillo that is feeding, for example, and moving litter on the floor. Could also be in the case of water, an animal getting in and out, like let's say a crocodile or alligator. And then other methods animals use audibly would be insects, for example, and their vibrating body parts. So oftentimes they will make sounds by beating their legs against their body, and you can think of the example of crickets or grasshoppers when they're doing that to try to attract a mate. And then there are many animals too that actually will use appendages, particularly their feet or claws, to send out signals on the landscape. Again, this could be either intentional or unintentional, so you can think of perhaps a cat marking a tree, or if you have a house cat at home and you have a scratching post, you know that you can hear that from a long way off. As well as you can think about numerous examples of birds, particularly ground-dwelling species, who they may be quite small or hard to hear movements on the ground when they're, say, looking for food, but they can also use that to communicate with each other, and this can be tuned into. The next category, which again is something that is very easy to tune into, are visual movements or postures. And many animals, like ourselves, like humans, have very good eyesight at picking up particular movements, and so it's a great way of communicating. Again, it can be both intentional and unintentional. So a few examples of this are tail waving. One of a common example of that would be like a white-tailed deer that feels threatened, raises its tail, and everybody else in the area sees that white flag and is warned. Either other members of the deer's family or the herd, or even the predator itself, to know that it's been spotted. Another example would be animals that do some sort of performance like dancing or strutting. So if you've ever seen a turkey when the male's trying to attract a female, or a peacock, or even something like an ostrich, which gives this amazing dance as part of its ritual. And of course, there are many other examples like that. And then even just behavior that probably is more unintentional, but would be like a charging or stalking animal. So we might think of a cat which is on the hunt and is crouching. Any other organism that sees that and spots that, of course, knows that it's hunting and is warned of that, and understands what that behavior means, versus, let's say, a cat that's gingerly just walking through a pasture or a field. And then the last major category that we want to think about are olfactory or scents that drift through the air. And this is oftentimes, as humans, something that we don't think about maybe as much as we should, because our sense of smell is not that strong, certainly compared to other animals like bears or canines. But there's so much language in here that is encoded, and it has an incredible amount of information. So when we think about that, the amount of information that's encoded in pheromones and other scents that drift off, and again, this is both intentional and unintentional. It can be animals who are marking using their glands, or it can just be their scent that is formed through metabolic processes that other animals pick up on. And science is really just beginning to delve deeply in this and understand how powerful that is and how much information is encoded in that. So when we refer to bird language, we're really talking about a subset of animal language. And again, there are many different types of animal languages. Bird language is one of, if not the easiest for us to tune into, because it's all around us. It's very easy to hear. It goes throughout the day, and also there are visual aspects to it. And when we actually use that term, we're really talking about a coarse way of understanding any and all avian communications that are being transmitted around us. So anything birds are doing, any sounds, vocalizations, movements, anything that we can detect with our senses, that is all part of bird language. We also want to remember that in this course, bird language is really focused on passerines for our purposes, not exclusively so, but that's predominantly what we're going to be studying and referring to, though there are some aspects of it that refer to other types of birds as well. And when we use that term, bird language, just remember that these are cues that are listened to or seen by other animals as well. So we're not just talking about humans, what we can hear or see, but any other organism that can pick up, again, on this communication that birds are transmitting. And specifically, we're referring to vocalizations and body postures, any sort of movement, and other aerial maneuvers. When we refer to bird language, we're actually talking about any sort of communication that's expressed on an individual level as well as by a group of birds. And this could be a small group, let's say a mating pair, as well as a large flock of mixed birds. And what we're trying to get out of that is what I refer to as the contextualized meaning. And this can be very complex. Again, there's a lot of behaviors birds have, a tremendous amount of vocalizations they have, as well as movements. So it's very complex, but we can learn to decipher this. And when we're doing this, we want to keep in mind that bird language is different from human language. So we don't really have a grammatical structure like we think about, if you remember in grade school when you were diagramming sentences, or verb conjugations, and other more detailed aspects of how we learn language. However, bird language does have a syntax, and science is really learning how to decipher that syntax, but without us going into the lab, we can still begin to understand that. And the important aspect of that is there's a semantic meaning to it, and that's really what we want to discern, and that's what we're most interested in. It can have syllables, so even though it doesn't have a complex grammatical structure like we think of, it can have a tremendous amount of information by basically composing a number of syllables and putting them together. And also, of course, birds use inflection, obviously tones. They have a tremendous range of vocalizations and sounds they can make, and they can even add emphasis. So there's been some scientists even say that certain species like parrots, which are your chickadees and titmice, the possible combinations that they could put together might be as much as almost 1/3 of human language. And that hasn't been detected yet, but that's one of the theories. And that just shows you how complex that their language actually is. And modern science is really just beginning to understand and tap into that by doing acoustical analysis and undertaking a number of experiments, which is really exciting because they're catching up now to what ancient humans have known for many, many centuries and even millennia. So for the vast majority of modern day humans, when we go out into a wilderness type setting or even just a local park and are moving through it, or maybe following a trail down to a creek or a river, we have what we call a zone of disturbance that greatly exceeds our zone of awareness. And we can see here from the diagram how that's denoted. And that's because we're moving through, and oftentimes we're making a lot of loud noises, being raucous. It could be just the way that we're walking or we're running, just creating all kinds of disturbances, as well as not tuning in to various clues. And in effect, we're sending out shock waves over the landscape. And the effect of that is that animals take off or flee before we ever see them. And you can see that from the diagram here where the deer has taken off and the bird has flown out, and this person never even saw them and will never even know that they were there. And this is really problematic on a couple of counts. One is that, again, it disturbs wildlife, and that's generally something that we don't want to do. They have enough difficulties as it is dealing with threats and survival from predators. But also, because we see far less, we have less enjoyment. And also, we just get less information back to understand what's going on around us. So this is not the ideal situation. Unfortunately, for most people, it is our default. But by using the methods that bird language teaches us, we can learn to reverse this. So in this diagram, we see the opposite occurring. And this is where our zone of awareness actually exceeds our zone of disturbance. And you can note here that this person is walking here or observing. Maybe they've paused, but the deer is just ahead and is feeding, and the bird is up in the canopy and has not flown off. And that's because this individual has been paying attention to the signs around them, has not disturbed the animals, has been moving in a very relaxed way and paying attention to other signals, which we're going to talk about in this course, and methods of how to do this. And because of that, their awareness goes much farther out than the shock waves of disturbance that they're sending. And again, this has benefits in not only not scaring off wildlife, but you get to see so much more. So this is what we want to learn to do, where that awareness goes as far out as possible on the landscape, well beyond the disturbance that we're sending out. And learning bird language will greatly enable us and teach us how to do this. Just as an example, let's say that you're walking, you're doing a little nature walk, you're being very mindful, and as you walk along, you don't set off a bird plow, but you come around the corner and there's an American robin who sees you and just does a little hook. Again, that's a mild alarm. It's not high on the scale of alarms, but it does create this effect in the area that anything nearby notice that robin hooks up. And again, the concept of everybody is listening to everything all the time. Well, if there are a few juncos who are nearby feeding on the ground, they may see that robin hook up into the tree and ditch themselves. They may not even see you on the trail. Let's say that you're hidden behind cover, but they know something is going on. And so, in effect, they create an area around them, and that's noted here by the dashed yellow line, their own area of disturbance. And so anything nearby, and let's say in this case you had some chickadees, some Carolina chickadees, who were above in a tree, and they saw the junco ditch. They saw them go into the shrubs below, and so perhaps they would begin alarming as well, sending out an alarm signal. And if they do that, then obviously they have their own ring where that alarm propagates. And so just beyond that area, there was, let's say in this case, a deer who was feeding. And it heard the chickadee's alarm and immediately pops its head up. Notices, starts looking around to try to figure out what's causing the alarm. Well, that deer, again, creates its own concentric ring. And perhaps there was a bobcat nearby who was watching this deer very closely, right? Maybe even wanted to stalk him, was in the process of seeing if it could make a kill. It sees that deer pick its head up and it immediately stops, right? And so in the process of doing that, it creates an alarm for anything that was seeing it. And in this case, let's assume that, which is shown by the green line here, let's assume that the crow detected that. It saw that bobcat stop, and maybe the crow knows this bobcat really well and knows that it likes to feed on deer and was thinking, well, hey, I'm going to get an easy meal on this. But now it knows that something is wrong. So the crow begins to alarm, right? Which again creates its own ring. And so you can see how this continues on and on. And even a small little event like this, and this may be an extreme example, but it can precipitate a whole series of alarms. So when you're out in the wild and you're walking around, if you want to see more wildlife, it's very important to minimize your alarms because any alarms that you set off, particularly the larger ones, are going to be repeated. And hunters, good hunters know this, that any small bird alarms or other animal alarms they set off, deer are going to tune into and their hunting chances go drastically down. As well as if you're just out viewing wildlife, you just want to be able to get close and see wildlife, you really want to work on minimizing your alarms because it is important and has a tremendous impact on what you see.